Madam President.
The junior senator from Alaska.
Madam President, I rise to talk about a very important and I believe very bipartisan issue, and it's the need for us in the Senate and the entire U.S. government to focus on the intensifying Chinese Communist Party threat and People's Liberation Army threat to Taiwan and why it matters. Now, Madam President, my remarks will be focusing primarily on the Chinese Communist Party, the leader of that party, Xi Jinping, not on the Chinese people who have a proud history, heritage, culture, thousands of years, and as we've seen over the last several weeks, they're very brave people who simply want more freedom. In March of 2021, in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, I asked the then Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral Davidson, when he thought there would be an invasion by the PLA and Chinese Communist Party of Taiwan. He responded to my question by saying this: "Senator, I think the threat of an invasion of Taiwan is manifest during this decade. In fact, within the next 6 years." Now, Madam President, that was 2 years ago almost. His successor, Admiral John Aquilino, has confirmed this timeline, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the director of National Intelligence, the CNO of the Navy, and even the Secretary of State have recently been ringing alarm bells on this timeline as well. On the heels of the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping has emerged as the ultimate supreme leader, surprising the assessment of even the most seasoned China hands with his audacity. He's packed the Politburo Standing Committee with loyalists, promoted party stalwarts with military, intelligence, and technology backgrounds, and positioned the Central Military Commission to preside over the conquest of Taiwan. Now, take a look at this poster. That's Chairman Xi and a bunch of his comrades I just talked about. And let's face it, they might look ridiculous in military fatigues. I think they do. But the message of these kind of propaganda photos are very, very clear. This was just recently sent out by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's this: China is preparing for war. Americans and the rest of the world should take this threat very seriously. I know that our eyes are on Ukraine, something that we should stay focused on. Defeating authoritarian aggression in Europe is essential to deterring it in Asia. But we can't lose sight of the threat to Taiwan and what is at stake. So I want to lay out today what will be the consequences of a potential invasion of Taiwan and why I believe vital American interests, security, economic interests are implicated by that, and what we should do, all of us together, to work to deter it. But I'd like to begin my remarks by focusing on a different era in a different region of the world. In 1948, the Soviets cut West Berlin off from food and fuel. And the United States and our allies, led by our powerful military, responded with the Berlin airlift. Many of you have seen this very famous photo taken during the Berlin airlift. At the height of this airlift, Allied supply flights were landing in West Berlin literally every minute. Think about that. We did that for a year to save this city, to save it from absorption into the tyrannical Soviet orbit and empire. Think about that, Madam President. Our citizens, our country, very tired and exhausted after World War II. Just a couple years later, somehow we understood that the stakes mattered in Berlin. And Americans look back on the Berlin airlift as a point of pride for our freedom-loving nation. John Kennedy famously visited Berlin in 1963, and before he went, he had seen Berlin as an irritant in Soviet-U.S. relations. But after declaring himself a Berliner, he came back and recognized, quote, Berlin as an asset, not a liability, in the wider struggle for Europe and global freedom. The United States defended the city and people of West Berlin during the 20th century because we understood as a country that this city and these citizens of this city stood on the front line of the struggle between the American-led free world and a powerful, expansionist, authoritarian regime. The same is true of Taiwan today. Taiwan is the 21st century's West Berlin. Now, Madam President, it's not as if American political leaders have disregarded the critical importance of Taiwan. To the contrary, starting with President Eisenhower, there has been a long and bipartisan consensus focused on the security of Taiwan. I have recently been rereading President Eisenhower's excellent memoirs, and you see the importance of Taiwan weaved in and out of the pages of these books. And this, of course, wasn't just the executive branch. This body in particular, the United States Senate, has been the ally of Taiwan during its darkest times, when the U.S. switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. It was congressional leaders like Senators Barry Goldwater and Bob Dole, as well as Democrats like Representative Lester Wolf, who worked on a bipartisan basis to give us the Taiwan Relations Act, one of the most remarkable pieces of foreign policy legislation the United States Congress has ever passed, led right here in the United States Senate. The President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, wanted to abandon a long-standing ally, Taiwan, and Congress said no. And in the process, America's legislative body rewrote our relationship with Taiwan, and that is the policy that still exists to this day and drives our relationship with the island democracy. With this remarkable legislation, Congress laid down the law and policy on Taiwan for generations, including up until today. And in 1979, Madam President, 84 U.S. senators, including a young senator named Joe Biden, voted for that important, very important piece of legislation. Those stalwart supporters of Taiwan, Republicans and Democrats, understood that the stakes were more than just about the island itself. They encompassed the issues of American leadership in Asia and our commitment, like we demonstrated in Berlin, to prevent a communist power on the march from devouring an outpost of freedom, this time in the Pacific. So, Madam President, given this history, it's not surprising that the fate of Taiwan has been weaved in and out of the careers of countless Americans, including my own. 27 years ago, I was a young Marine infantry officer deployed to the Taiwan Strait as part of a Marine Amphibious Ready Group and 2 U.S. carrier strike groups, all in response to Chinese Communist Party's aggressive military provocations on the eve of presidential elections in Taiwan. The third Taiwan Strait crisis, this period, 1995 to 96, is now called. This was an important and decisive demonstration of America's commitment and resolve to an emergency democracy and partner that is still remembered in the region by everybody. This is a picture of a ship, the ship that I was on during that time. Later, Madam President, I was part of another demonstration of American commitment and resolve when Senators Tammy Duckworth and Chris Coons and I flew to Taiwan on that aircraft. That's a picture of our flight, where we were able to bring close to 1 million vaccines to the Taiwanese people. We did this in the face of the Chinese Communist Party's aggressive attempts to prevent the citizens of Taiwan from receiving this life-saving medicine from Western countries. And so America responded. I'll never forget, Madam President, my first trip as a U.S. Senator on a CODEL led by Senator McCain to Taiwan. We were getting on the bus after getting off the airplane, and the State Department official from our de facto embassy there, the American Institute in Taiwan, greeted the Senate delegation by saying this: "Welcome to Taiwan, a vibrant democracy of 24 million people with one of the most innovative economies in the world, a hub of trade and cutting-edge technology, and the only reason this incredible place exists on a map as such is because of the sacrifice and commitment of the United States of America, our military, our government, and our citizens." All Americans should be very proud of this. That's what he said. Very moving, very true. What a powerful greeting. So American commitment and resolve on Taiwan has been part of our law, our heritage, trade, economics, military deployments for decades. But I worry too few Americans know this history and the reason for this commitment. We need to rebuild this understanding to ready ourselves for the test of wills that I believe is approaching. This starts with all of us doing a better job of explaining to the American people collectively why Taiwan matters. In this regard, one question that I don't believe has been asked or analyzed enough is a difficult question to contemplate, but it's this: what would the world look like, and how would American interests be implicated by a PLA or Chinese Communist Party takeover of Taiwan? So over the last several weeks, actually several months, I've asked different U.S. government agencies, intel agencies, think tanks, military commands to help me think through this important but little studied question. And perhaps it's little studied because it's a difficult and depressing assignment to contemplate. The Chinese Communist Party and the PLA launch a massive, multi-pronged, violent military invasion of Taiwan, and U.S. forces either do not get there on time, either decide we're not going to go there at all, or actually go to the Taiwan Strait and are defeated by the PLA in their attempt to defend Taiwan. None of this is something that we, as Americans, want to contemplate. Nevertheless, I believe it is our job as leaders to help our fellow Americans understand the ramifications of precisely this scenario today in order to better prevent it from taking place in the future. So let's look at that world and what it would look like, particularly with regard to American interests. A successful PLA military invasion and takeover of Taiwan would be a massive blow to the commanding heights of the technology that powers our digital age. As you can see from this chart, Taiwan dominates the production of the world's most advanced semiconductors. Secure supplies of advanced computer chips today are as important to our economy and that of our allies as the supply of oil has been for us and our allies for decades previously. Suddenly being deprived of these advanced computer chips would have a devastating impact on the U.S. and global economies, negatively impacting millions of good-paying jobs. Just look at the current impact of the current chip shortage. According to the Commerce Department, in 2021 alone, it costs the U.S. economy $240 billion, $250 billion, including 7.7 million fewer cars being produced because of the low-end chip shortage we have now. And this hasn't just been an inconvenience for those in the market for new cars. This has been devastating in terms of manufacturing jobs in America. Imagine what would happen if home to 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductor production, which is what Taiwan is, were taken offline. It would cost us multiple times more than the $240 billion I just mentioned. All in all, a military conflict over Taiwan launched by Xi Jinping could cost the global economy, according to a recent State Department estimate, $2.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion. And this sum does not justify the huge strategic advantage the Chinese Communist Party would gain if it seized the crown jewels of the global economy, which is what they strongly desire, and that is the fabrication of the world's most advanced computer chips. And this would also present an extraordinary challenge to the U.S. ability to defend itself not only abroad but at home. As you know, Madam President, advanced microchips from Taiwan feed directly into our ability to develop and sustain our most sophisticated military weapons, F-35s, radars, missile defenses, just to name a few. This translates into great risk for our national security and, importantly, the men and women in uniform who defend us. Second, there is Taiwan's geostrategic value, not just economic value, that of course would be shattered by a successful PLA invasion of the island. In his memoirs, President Eisenhower devotes pages and pages to Taiwan. At one point, he says, quote, "If the capture of Taiwan's offshore island should in fact lead to the loss of Taiwan, the future security of Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, even Okinawa would be placed in jeopardy, and the United States' vital interests would suffer severely." Last year, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Eli Ratner, made essentially the same point in his testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Now, certain critics rung him up for it, apparently calling Taiwan a critical node within the first island chain and an anchor of a network of U.S. allies and partners in Asia, as Assistant Secretary Ratner did, risks offending Beijing's sensibilities. But, Madam President, of course, Secretary Ratner and President Eisenhower were correct. Taiwan, in the CCP's hands, breaks China out of the constraints of this area in the Pacific known as the First Island Chain. And a CCP takeover of Taiwan has the potential to further push the U.S. and our forces out into the Pacific in what's called the Second Island Chain, out this far. And this includes American territories and Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, just to name a few. And, Madam President, as you know, these aren't just points on a grand strategist's map. Residents in Guam and the Mariana Islands are American citizens. They send representatives to Congress. Guam has an enormous U.S. military presence with tens of thousands of service members and their families. With the first island chain broken, these Americans will come under direct threat from an emboldened China with a massive and growing military. And here's the other thing. It is highly unlikely that the CCP would stop simply at Taiwan. If history teaches us anything, it is that the appetite of an aggressive authoritarian regime on the march increases with each meal. For decades, the CCP has focused almost exclusively on building a military with the objective of conquering Taiwan. Take a look at this force posture that currently exists across the Taiwan Strait. It's a rather depressing picture. These are the military capabilities and numbers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and this is that of Taiwan. You look at the additional numbers, what each of these means in terms of infantry, naval forces, air forces. It's a massive, massive overmatch right now in this period of the world. And if there is an invasion that's successful, do we really think that these forces are just going to stay around Taiwan? No. They're going to shoot out to all other parts of the Pacific and other parts of the world. The Chinese Communist Party and PLA's military will be supercharged for expansion. Madam President, President Eisenhower was also deeply concerned about the impact a successful CCP invasion of Taiwan would have on American alliances and our ability to credibly meet our defense treaty obligations to them. This concern continues to today. We look at our allies in the region, and I want to commend the Prime Minister of Japan just a few days ago, who stepped up, saw significant challenges, primarily the Chinese Communist Party, and is saying Japan's military is going to grow significantly. That's a hugely important development. It's great news for our national security as we work closely with Japan. But a Chinese PLA takeover of Taiwan, in my view, would threaten and call into question our treaty military commitments throughout the region. Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand. Of course, it's always hard to predict the future, but there is little doubt that a Chinese communist takeover of Taiwan would, in some countries' minds, call into question our alliance commitments. It could cause some countries to build up their own military capabilities, including possibly nuclear deterrence when they currently don't have it, or choose a much more accommodating Middle Kingdom posture towards their powerful neighbor. This, of course, should concern all Americans. The questioning of our Pacific network of alliances that undergird the security of the American homeland by our allies and by balancing and deterring dangers far away from our shores, I believe makes Americans less safe. Finally, Madam President, a Chinese communist takeover Taiwan would give a global boost to the CCP's model of authoritarian governance that Xi has been offering the world. In the 1930s, during a time of global upheaval, of which there are striking parallels today, many around the world thought that the future lay with fascism. Such a future was alluring to millions. Democracy can be messy. Disagreements, sometimes ferocious disagreement, is the hallmark of representative government. And because of the transparency inherent in democracies, it is there for all the world to see, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The United States, along with other democracies around the globe, ultimately prevailed against the rise of fascism during World War II. We did so by force of arms, but also by appeal to the universal desire for freedom and self-government that we led. But a military takeover of Taiwan in the current global climate could lead many to believe that, as Xi Jinping has put it himself, the CCP's totalitarian vision offers a new choice for humanity, one that relies on techno-authoritarian control rather than self-governance. We cannot be blind to the implications or the extraordinary new legitimacy that the CCP would gain at home and abroad. And with that would come new forms of CCP aggression throughout Asia and throughout the world. So, Madam President, the next slide has a summary of a number of these issues of why Taiwan matters. It's actually a slide taken from a slide deck in a briefing out at Indo-PACOM Command, where I serve as a Marine Corps colonel. And it's a good summary of what China would gain, what the U.S. would lose. I won't go through each one of these. I've talked about a lot of them. But the authoritarian world that the CCP is offering is not what Xi Jinping bills it as. Look at its manifestations today. Concentration camps for Uyghurs, repression in Hong Kong, prison for peaceful dissidents, no freedom of religion, speech, or assembly, mass censorship and social control, pandemic lockdowns approximating house arrests for millions of citizens guilty of no crime, a cult of personality around a leader who brooks no consent, and a world order built on CCP power and values, freedom and American interests would be unsafe in many parts of the world. Take a hard look at that. This is why Taiwan matters. So, Madam President, my purpose today was to paint a picture of what the world would look like in the face of a successful CCP PLA invasion of Taiwan. What I want to talk very briefly about next is what we should do about it. I've talked about this slide many times. As a matter of fact, the presiding officer and I have had a lot of discussions, but this is where we should be focused. None of us wants a war in the Taiwan Strait, and if one is launched, it's going to be by Xi and the CCP and the PLA. It won't be launched by the United States of America, it won't be launched by Taiwan. So what do? We need to work to deter it. Now, I've often talked about 3 levels of deterrence that we need in the Taiwan Strait. First is Taiwan's own defense capabilities, like the Ukrainians are showing the world bravely, heroically right now, that smaller countries committed to their own self-governance and self-rules can fight and take on giant authoritarian regimes, like the Ukrainians are showing the world today. We need to make sure Taiwan has the capability to do that itself. As a matter of fact, there's discussions going on right now in the omnibus, and I sure hope the administration weighs in heavily about more assistance for Taiwan to build up its own military and weapons capability. The second level of deterrence, of course, Madam President, is our ability as a country with our allies to come to Taiwan's aid if the President so orders. That has been a constant in the decades-long history during these different crises when there's been threats by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA to invade Taiwan. The United States has shown up every time. That's going to be increasingly important, and we need the capability to do that. And finally, Madam President, a topic you and I have spoken about quite a lot, is a third level of deterrence, which actually isn't talked about that much, but in my view, and in the view of many of our intel analysts, could be the most powerful, and that is devastating economic and financial consequences that we should let the Chinese Communist Party know about now that would ensue if they invaded Taiwan. Economic, financial, energy. Madam President, that's why I've been pushing my legislation called the Stand with Taiwan Act. It's legislation that would have very broad-based sanctions that would be triggered against all aspects of the Chinese Communist Party's economy and its leadership that would be triggered by an invasion of Taiwan by the PLA. This is something I believe we as the Congress need to pass. It's something that I have pitched to many of our allies in Europe, in Asia, and it's something that I think could have an enormous positive deterrent effect in the Taiwan Strait. So let me conclude with this. With the invasion of Ukraine, it is clear that we have entered a new era of authoritarian aggression led by Xi Jinping and Putin, like we saw in the 1930s. For nearly a century, American presidents have seen Asia and Europe as theaters that, if under hostile control, would put U.S. national security risks at extreme risk for the United States. And generations of Americans have fought and died so that East Asia and Europe would not fall under the dictatorial control of U.S. adversaries. Both of these theaters are at risk today. The world cannot be neutral in this contest between freedom and authoritarianism, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. American alliances, power, and ingenuity have helped build a world that has provided more freedom and prosperity to more people than ever before. In fact, think about it, Madam President. The United States democracy, bolstered by our strong military, has done more to liberate humankind from oppression and tyranny, literally hundreds of millions of people, than any other force in human history. The Chinese Communist Party has clear plans to reverse all of this. It knows exactly what it wants to accomplish: to make the world safe for its tyrannical government, to profit off the export of its authoritarian model to other countries, to separate America from our democratic allies, and to erode U.S. leadership. A world governed by Xi Jinping's totalitarian vision would be a world unsafe for America and our friends. And that is why Taiwan is so important and central to the future of the free world. It is a thriving, prosperous Chinese democracy that holds free elections with power bounded by the rule of law. For that reason, it threatens the CCP's central premise that one man ruling in perpetuity by crushing all dissent knows what's best for 1.4 billion people. The Chinese Communist Party has already crushed Hong Kong, once a bastion of liberty, and the free world barely raised its voice in protest. Should America and the world stand by as China does something similar to Taiwan, a peaceful democracy of 24 million people, that would not simply undermine the security of the Western Pacific, as the Taiwan Relations Act says, but would undermine America's role in the world and the values we as Americans have infused into it. And I believe it would deeply and adversely affect concrete American national security and economic security interests. So I am committed to working with all of my colleagues. The presiding officer has been a leader on many of these issues, working with her and others to make sure that that world never comes to pass. This is why Taiwan matters, and we need policies of deterrence, all of them, to prevent its violent takeover by the Chinese Communist Party. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Iowa.